whatever the normal drug is. Let's say you have a new drug for cancer. So you have to compare the old drug for cancer against the new drug for cancer. You can't compare the new drug for cancer against nothing. Okay, this is a kind of rule of the game. So you're always comparing the new thing to the most recently approved or accepted thing. So there's this concept called treatment as usual. And so the control group gets treatment as usual. If that treatment is not treated, then that means you're not taking anything. If the treatment is you get a drug, then it has to be compared to that treatment. So there was a really interesting kind of moral dilemma around what treatment as usual would mean in the case of the homeless people. And so when there was a lot of criticism of the trial, the researchers literally began saying things like, well, they're used to being denied housing. They're used to being denied services. They're used to living on the streets. They're used to being out in the cold. So they're used to all of these very problematic conditions. And so if they aren't given housing, it's no different than what they're experiencing already. Okay, so technically, by the rules of the trial, that was true. That was treatment as usual. But that then began to raise the question for me of what does it mean? What is the bottom line that a society wants to make for treatment as usual? Is it acceptable to leave people in a situation that is otherwise below the threshold of rights simply because it's treatment as usual? Some of these are I think, sort of boring details. Okay, so one of the other arguments the researchers made had to do with given that if you accept the argument that treatment as usual was still an inhumane treatment, but this was sort of how life was. The researchers came back and they said, well, the subjects consented to the study. We went through a whole consent process and they agreed to be in the study. I think many of us felt like that was kind of a big ask when you have less than nothing and you have an option, a 50% chance of getting something. It was sort of unclear what does consent actually mean in that situation. Clearly they were consenting to not getting housing again, because they had a 50% chance of not getting housing. So it was really complicated to understand what this consent process could possibly mean. But if you make the argument that the condition, this treatment as usual condition, was below the threshold of their rights, then what they're consenting to is remaining in a condition of having their rights. Okay. Under criminal law, you cannot consent to violence. There are very, very specific cases in Canadian law, particularly the game of hockey, where people are said to consent to having acts of violence on themselves. But in almost all other cases, the law will not allow you to consent to violence, even if you attempt to. Because to allow people to consent to violence undermines the whole notion of consent to begin with. Since consent is something about having a violent act perpetrated on, having something strongly against your will. So in a similar way, we would want to ask the question, can we consent, can the research subjects be asked to consent to giving up a human right? So I think there were a number of ways in which that is exactly what they were being asked to give up. So in the first instance, they were asked to agree to remain homeless, which is a violation of their civil rights, of their universal rights. There's a second way that's a bit more technical that I want to explain. And this I think we can expand if we want to think of this as a kind of fantasy legal case or a fantasy legal argument. In a randomized controlled trial, statistically, you can't prove something to be true. I don't know if you guys have had stats, but it's just the way the math of that particular statistical structure works. What you're doing is you're saying that the opposite condition is not correct. So you're not able to prove that housing is useful. You're only able to prove that it is incorrect to say that housing is not useful, because you're always negating the null hypothesis. So although researchers commonly say, oh, we proved that X is true, if they use a randomized control trial, that's actually not correct. It's not mathematical. So good researchers will be more casual. They'll say, well, we showed that it's not the case that these two things are the same. So the structure of a randomized control trial is these two things are the same. Is that true? That's what we're testing. Are these two things in fact the same? Oh, they're not the same. So if you begin saying in this randomized control trial, if the null hypothesis is being housed and not being housed are the same, we're setting up a study to prove that that's not true, then you've just made a research question that runs counter to a human right. You can't, it does not make sense legally or morally to say you have a right to something, but it's no good. It has no value. Okay, so the structure of the trial, the logic of the trial, began to place a numerical value on housing as a right, simply by posing that question in that way, as a function of that particular research design. It was even worse than that because there were a lot of costing questions involved in the study. So several of the studies had multiple wings. So there were the homeless people who remained homeless, and then there were people in a couple of different modalities. And so there were questions about which of those were more and less expensive. There were questions about whether it was cheaper to house people than to have them in the criminal justice system. So even after the trial closed, they're following people's social insurance numbers and seeing whether they end up in jail. So there was a huge amount of randomized control trial question making around these costing issues. So in a sense, what the research subjects were being asked to do was consent to being part of a research project that would put a dollar value on their right to housing, and potentially say that it's too costly to provide housing. Okay, so this again, I think, is another violation. It's a use of a research design in service of violating someone's human right. Because of the way the study was designed, essentially there weren't enough people in the study. It was too small. And the differences between the cities was too great. So you really had a whole bunch of many variables, including city differences. There were a whole bunch of different variables. So they really needed a much larger trial. So one of the big fights that the ethics board had was we had a whole bunch of statisticians in debating whether the trial was big enough or not. One of the problems is that if there aren't enough trial subjects, there's this mathematical condition called futility. So they get to this certain point in a trial and they say mathematically we're not going to be able to show any difference between these things that you're studying. So we don't know whether there's a difference or not a difference. And so under the randomized controlled trial regulations, you must stop the trial at that point. So there were quite a few studies in this time period that were being halted early because mathematically they weren't going to be able to show any kinds of differences. And so there was a very real possibility in this whole study that they were not going to be able to have any outcomes, any statistically reliable outcomes, because there was a math problem embedded in the study. And so that begged the question of what do you do when you have a huge federal study that at the end of the study you have no research result? You can't say housing's good, you can't say housing's bad, you can't differentiate among the different types of housing. So if the ambition was to influence policy, which was one of the big rationales of the study, then you were basically designing a study that had a good chance of not being able to have an outcome at the end of it. So you were asking the research subjects to consent to be in a trial, the outcome of which would be to produce policy that were counter to the trial subject's interests. So again, I want to make an analogy to the criminal law, like refusal to allow you to consent to have violence done to you. So in a sense, the research subjects at almost every turn were being asked not just to risk not getting into the housing wing of the study, but to risk a whole bunch of other outcomes of the actual trial itself, the meaning of the trial itself. Now, while this was going on, there was another set of, as I mentioned, we live in research Disneyland. So there were another set of research trials going on with overlapping research subjects. These were methadone maintenance trials. There were several of them, and they were really complex trials. They had a very small number of participants. So from a math point of view, they were like super, super, super sophisticated. They really pulled out all of the latest advances in theoretical statistics to try to come up with good trials. So they were actually really well designed trials. So the first trial was a give people heroin versus methadone trial. It was a head-to-head trial with 90 research subjects. So one of the rules of randomized controlled trials, a feature of a randomized controlled trial is half the people get a good thing and the other half don't. So if the good thing turns out to really be good, the other half didn't get it. And so you're obliged to give it to them at the end of the study. Okay. Obviously in the housing trial that didn't happen. There was no new housing. They lost their housing at the end of the trial. In the methadone maintenance versus heroin trial, they got to the end of the trial and the research subjects were like, great, we've proven that heroin works. Heroin's better than methadone, hooray! The government will change its policy and they'll start prescribing heroin, and the government said, I'm not going to do that. And so they said, well, wait a minute, here we are. We were happily being prescribed heroin, and we were doing really, really well. We're at our jobs, our lives are good, and now you're taking that successful drug away from us. And so those researchers were kind of in a bad place because they were trying to follow the rules. And so they were kind of hemming and hawing and trying to decide what to do. They had to get the government to change the regulation on controlled substances. And so while the government was trying to figure out how to give them heroin, a bunch of the research subjects crashed and burned. And so one of the guys named Dave Murray, he's going around, he's really well known. He's a long-term junkie involved in a lot of political organizing. He refused to go into the housing trial because he said, this is too screwed up. They're going to take the housing away at the end. I'd rather stay on the wait list. So he was walking down the street one day and he was asking about his buddies from this trial, which was called Naomi. Very biblical name. And it turned out that about 30-ish of the 92 original subjects had died in the year following the trial. And so he said, well, we need to start organizing. So he began organizing what are called the Naomi survivors research subject. So the researchers in the heroin trials wanted to do another study. And they said, maybe Dilaudid is better than heroin. And so there were 4 different drugs they were trying. And they were trying injection, but it was just a really, really complicated trial. And they needed 275 people to do this trial. So they went to Dave and his friends. And they're like, Dave, can you find 275 people for us? And Dave said, maybe, but you have to give us things we want. So Dave and the Naomi survivors began organizing heroin users who had been involved in a lot of different studies over time, and they formed a union to basically broker themselves to the researchers to have certain demands met. So they became, and this was some of the work I'm very proud to have done, they became experts at how randomized controlled trials work. So they could go into the researchers and they would say, okay, this arm and this arm, I don't think you have enough people in those arms. So they were really in critiquing the actual structure of these heroin-related trials and demanding, they said, we won't go on the trial unless we're guaranteed some drug at the end of the trial. If Dilaudid's better, great, we'll take Dilaudid, but if heroin's better, we want the heroin. And the researchers were like, well, we're not sure if we can do that because the government has to change the rules. And they said, great, we'll wait. You get the rule changed and then we'll enter the trial. So they had a number of demands. They wanted blanket health care. They didn't want just addiction care while they were in the study. They wanted total health care, a total umbrella of health care. They argued for housing. They argued for a whole bunch of benefits that they said would support them as research subjects in this trial. And they argued things like, if we're homeless during the trial, you won't have good research results because our lives will be really bad. So they were really, really quite aggressive in trying to argue for the trial. So I approached them, a couple of us approached them and said, why don't you try to organize the Chez-Soi subjects, research subjects. There was an advisory board for the Chez-Soi project that had consumers, so-called consumers, people with mental illnesses who had had housing problems, who were not very happy with the study, but felt like they couldn't say too much. And so, in talking through with the Naomi survivors group, they knew a lot of people in the Chez-Soi project. Some of them were in the Chez-Soi project, but they said, we can't organize the homeless people in Chez-Soi because everyone's so afraid of losing their housing. And they feel like even if they only have housing for a year and they go back on the streets, that's better than having no housing at all. So it became clearer and clearer that even in the face of heroin addiction, having housing was seen as something desperately, desperately that you would take no matter what, that you wouldn't organize research subjects against. I'll sort of stop there. I'll tell you one last story. I happened to live across the street from one of the housing sites. Vancouver, if you've seen pictures, we have these beautiful, beautiful high-rise buildings. They go up like corn stalks. And so real estate is incredibly valuable, even tiny little pieces of real estate. And so when the Chez-Soi project was created, the city negotiated with one of the developers and said, can we have, there was like an old motel kind of thing. And they said, can we have that for this study? And we won't make you